Hello, it's qualifiers, and I've had a hard job for the past couple of weeks because I have taken it upon myself to review and analyze the album Drogas by Lupe Fiasco. I think I've made some sort of sense out of it. I still think I have a long way to go, but here are my thoughts. I do think that Lupe Fiasco is an unusually hard artist to review. And that's not just because of the famous abstractness and complexity of his lyrics, it's because sometimes Lupe's music seems to serve a different purpose than, most other music in the world. I don't think that it's too much of a generalization to say that most artists make music to express their feelings and to get something off their chest, to deal with their personal issues. And a lot of the time, even if these artists are exploring political topics or social issues, there's still some connection back to themselves. For Lupe, there usually doesn't really seem to be. His albums are remarkably impersonal. Yeah, Lupe's albums, they don't really seem to be very much about Lupe. They seem to be much more about exploring different themes, different ideas, different social issues in a very smart and subtle way, in a very globally conscious way, which almost sees Lupe himself as just one little tiny piece in some big overarching equation. Even when Lupe brings up a personal anecdote or a personal story on an album like Tetsuo in Youth, it seems to mostly be there because it supports the themes of the album. It's sort of like when you include a personal story in your SAT essay. It might be powerful in its own right, but it's really only there because it supports your thesis. There is a genre that Lupe's working within. There are other concept albums whose primary purpose is to string ideas together through a big, complex, loosely woven together narrative. I'm thinking especially of that Mr. Leaf album, which is probably one of my favorites in that genre. And, I can like this genre, and I do like the way that Lupe does social commentary. I think he's really nuanced about it. He understands that there's not just one side to every issue, and he's very humanistic. I like the song Prisoner 1 and 2 quite a bit because he takes on the personas of all these different people who are caught in the prison industrial complex, be they the prisoners or even the guards. But he also understands that despite the fact that everybody is trapped, some people still are more oppressed than others. At least the guards can leave. And it's this kind of subtle and complex understanding of social issues, which is the reason that intellectually I really appreciate Lupe and I really respect Lupe and what he's doing. But when it comes down to really enjoying a Lupe album, it doesn't happen that often. I am biased towards music with a more personal touch. I love Food and Liquor, because to me that album does have the human touch. It feels personal. And I could sometimes enjoy the cool. I certainly really appreciate what he did with that album. But beyond that, I do have a little bit of trouble enjoying entire Lupe albums. I tend to be someone who takes out individual songs and will listen to them, but can't really deal with the whole album at once. So when Drogas Wave came out, I decided to challenge myself to push past my bias. I wanted to engage with this Lupe album the way that Lupe intended for me to engage with it. I wanted to go deep on the lyrics and on the themes, and I didn't want to hold it against Lupe if he didn't talk about himself that much, because I don't think that he was really intending to make an album that was super personal, and I shouldn't hold him to those standards if that wasn't what he was going for. So in this album review, I wanted to really think about what the lyrics meant, try to dive into this album philosophically, figure out some of the symbolism, and as a result, this review kind of turned into a two-parter. The first 10 minutes of this review are me trying to explain what I think each of the songs meant and how they connected to each other, and the last 10 minutes are a more general overview of how I felt about things like the production and the overall tone of the album and the overall message. So If you want to hear an in-depth lyrical analysis, you can just keep on watching, but if you'd rather hear a more conventional review, you can skip to around this timestamp. So without any further ado, let's get into the symbolism and let's get into the themes of Drogas Wave. And it definitely seems like there's something important about water on this album, that water has some important significance. And now when I think of water, I think of something that's fluid, something that can spread and change shape and get into all these little cracks where you don't expect it to be. It's almost like water obeys by different rules than a lot of the normal solid things that we see in everyday life. And when you're underwater, it can feel like you've entered into a different world where the rules are maybe a little more fluid and where things can change more rapidly, where maybe certain things could exist that wouldn't exist on land. Because it feels like every time someone enters the water on this album, things become possible that wouldn't be possible in the real world. Like the slaves who fall off the ship and think they're going to drown in the water, but find out completely improbably that they can breathe and that there's a whole city of people down there. Or the song Alan Forever, which is about a Syrian boy named Alan who's going to immigrate to Greece with his family, but he falls off the boat and drowns. Now, Alan is a real person, and in the real world, we know he drowned when he was a little kid. But in this song, he doesn't drown. He learns to swim, and in the end, he becomes an Olympic athlete. Whenever water has the potential to destroy something on this album, it seems like there's an equally likely possibility, or at least a parallel universe, in which water actually saves and preserves that thing. And it seems like water not only creates this environment where people who actually died could have lived, where things that didn't happen could happen, but it creates an environment where, because these people lived, everything in our world would have been a little different. Like the slaves at the bottom of the ocean, they don't just thrive and survive there, they create a culture of pulling down other slave ships and saving other slaves, and eventually the descendants of that city at the bottom of the ocean go back on land, travel across the world, and try to help other communities. Or like in Alan Forever, where at the end of the story, when Alan grows up and becomes a professional swimmer, he ends up saving a boy who's fallen off a boat. And just to drive the point home, Lupe Fiasco points out that he saved himself. Now, this is a little bit cutesy, I think. You know, it's all a circle. Like, if Alan lives, then he saves another person who's just like him. But I think it also brings home the tragedy of this concept, because if Alan died, like in our world he did, there would have been no one to save that other boy. In the parallel universe where the slaves were building a city at the bottom of the ocean, they got to go out and help other communities and pass down their values. But in the real world, where those slaves all died when they fell off the ship, the descendants of those people, of that group, never got to benefit. So when someone like Alan or Jonah or the slaves on that slave ship die, that's not just a tragedy that exists outside of context. That's not just a tragedy for them. It's a tragedy for the people who will come after them. And I think Lupe builds on that theme in the song Don't Mess Up the Children, where he's talking about how the children are gonna get messed up if they're not raised in a culture, if they don't know where they came from, if they don't know their traditions, if they don't have a strong community of people telling them this is where you belong. I think what Lupe Fiasco is talking about is the vicious cycle that happens in a community when a lot of people die young or their lives are destroyed and they're not there to help out the community that served them. And then because they aren't there to be role models, there's a whole new generation of people who grow up in a community without that kind of mentorship, without those older people to help them out. So the children get messed up, and this lack, this need keeps getting passed down from generation to generation. And also around that time on the album, Lupe brings back the water metaphors in the song Haile Selassie, and I would like to look at this song and the water metaphors in it in a little more detail. Now, I really like the first image here of someone opening up a hydrant and it's spraying all over the street and people swimming around and playing around in the water. Because if you've ever seen a hydrant being opened up, it's not like a tame thing. It's not like turning on a hose. It's this huge spurt of water that just comes streaming out at intense velocity and kind of just doses the entire street. And it's interesting right off the bat to think about this large quantity of water, which is really powerful and should be used or was intended to be used for putting out fires, being used just to play around in. So now it flashes to this image of Lupe trying to block out some kind of danger. We don't really know what it is. The noise could be gunshots, the noise could be the noise of the water, since that's something that's very dangerous throughout the course of this album. But whatever it is, he manages to just tune it out and go to sleep, and his sleep and his dreams are represented again by water. He goes into the sea of his dreams. So right away, water is this thing that has the potential to be destructive, but when you can kind of control it, it has the potential to be a refuge and to take you back to where you came from. Now, this is pretty reminiscent of another line in the song Wave Files, where Lupe Fiasco talks about a slave who is going to walk across the water back to Africa to find his community and to find his roots. And I'm not going to go into all of the times on Haile Selassie when water is referenced, but there are a lot of other lines which portray Lupe as someone who has a special power over water, who can manipulate water, who is helped by and supported by water. He just knows how to control it. And about the 8th or ninth time I listened to Haile Selassie, I started to put certain things together. For one thing, as I mentioned, water is fluid and changeable. It's clear, you can see through water, and it seems like what you can see in the water is the way things might have been or should have been. It seems like you can visit your past through the water, like that slave that was able to walk across the water back to Africa. It's kind of a portal in that way. And whatever it is, Lupe seems very adept in the water. It seems like the water is the medium where Lupe feels most at home. And even though water seems like a soft, fluid thing, it's clearly also very powerful. It can destroy slave ships. So, what is the water? It seems like water, at least to me, might just be a metaphor for imagination or storytelling. After all, through stories, you can revisit the past. You can imagine what things might have been like in other time periods. And storytelling, like water, is powerful. Unexpectedly so. Sometimes it can even be powerful enough to tear through reality and social constraints and show a glimpse of a better future. And that's really what I think Lupe is talking about on this album. And this song, Haile Selassie, is also the song where I think Lupe Fiasco is connecting the concerns about community and about culture and sustaining culture that he raises on the first half of the album with this idea of storytelling. Because after all, Haile Selassie was someone who was very into cultural identity and solidarity, and Haile Selassie inspired and invigorated a whole country and a whole culture mostly through oration, through words. Now, this is an album that's largely about Black culture, and it is about celebrating Black culture, but I think some of the album, especially this first 2/3, is about mourning the losses of Black culture, because slavery devastated African cultures. There were values and there were traditions that would have been passed down, there were communities that would have stayed together, that were just split apart and devastated, and most of the people died, and we'll never really know what it would have been like if slavery hadn't happened. And it seems to me that Lupe is saying that Black people especially need aspirational stories, firstly to fill in the gaps of knowledge that were lost or missing, And secondly, to spread hope, to see a way that things could have been different in the past, and by doing that, see a way that things can be different in the future. And that brings me to the last third of this album, where Lupe transitions from honoring people whose lives were cut short before they could serve their communities in the way that they really could have or should have, to celebrating the lives of people who actually did serve the Black community, did help rebuild and reinvigorate Black culture after slavery. People like the Black Panthers, like Haile Selassie. And he celebrates these people not just for their contributions to the Black community, not just for their activism, but for their storytelling ability. And this all culminates with the really fun song Timbuktu Day, which is celebrating Timbuktu, who was an artist who was very active in the 90s. He was a DJ, and he helped a lot of other younger artists start their careers. And I love that the song is called Timbuktu Day, because it really does feel like a big celebration of everything that Timbuktu loved. Lupe's rapping in this very fast, very clever, very silly way that does remind me of some of the more playful 90s bands. It also has this shouted hook, "Give me the mic, give me the mic, give me the mic, give me the mic," which sounds like something that Tribe Called Quest could have laid down. The only thing I wish were different about this song was the production. I wish it were a little bit jazzier, a little bit quirkier. It has the same kind of subdued pianos and pre-programmed drums that appear on almost every other beat on this album. And for a song that's supposed to be a celebration of this great artist active in the 90s and the early 2000s, the beat could have brought that back a little bit more. Yeah, and unfortunately, the production was an ongoing problem for me on this album. It is very pristine, it is very beautiful and well arranged, but it just doesn't have a lot of the urgency or the vibrancy to really match the intensity of Lupe's lyricism and Lupe's flows on this album. The highlight of these beats is the drums, which they're at the front of the mix, and they take on a really nice, echoey, boom-bappy quality, which works really well on some of the more old-school tracks here. I really like it. But as for the rest of the instrumentation, while it is pretty and orchestral, it's almost too pristine to the point of feeling kind of inhuman. There's almost no organic instrumentation on this album, and it really shows. I've been thinking a little bit about why it seems like some critics aren't really taking the time to understand the themes of this album. It seems like they're just listening to it a few times and thinking more cursorily about the lyrics, and I wonder if part of the reason is because the music here is so mellow and chill that it kind of belies the emotionality of the album. If Lupe Fiasco really wanted people to pay attention to his lyrics and to his themes more, I think that he should try to up the rawness and the vulnerability and the expressiveness of the music. But there are certainly a few songs where Lupe succeeds in getting the production and the beat to match up really well with the mood of the song. Like on the song Cripple, where the wandering kind of improvisational flute melody, which is one of the only organic instruments on the whole album, it matches really well with the abstract kind of stream of conscious lyrics, which are hard to decode, but at least what it seems like they're about is just living in the city, all of the sights, all of the sounds. It's a very sensory song, all the different forces that are at work there, be they the artists that are trying to reinvigorate the local scene, or the politicians which are trying to prop up existing systems, and in the background of it all, the gangs and the violence that's real and that's tearing through the community, and Lupe Fiasco's confusion at trying to make all of those different pieces and people and scenes fit together into one coherent whole. And with the jazzier, more improvisational beat and stream of consciousness poeticism of some of the lyrics, the tendency to repeat phrases until they become more and more and more meaningful, all of this reminded me of the stuff that Milo has been putting out recently, and that for the most part I felt really positive towards. I think where this album succeeds the most musically is when Lupe gets a little more old school. Songs like Stack That Cheese or Imagine or XO, the beats don't quite have the complicated orchestral quality that pervades a lot of the rest of the album. And even though they're not really quite as beautiful, they're a little bit simpler, they have like this propulsion and this energy and this urgency that a lot of the rest of the album lacks. My ears started to really perk up in the last third of this album, because that's the time when it feels like Lupe is really demanding our attention. Lupe also seems to be able to better lock into the rhythm of some of the more old school beats. It seems like he's a little bit more comfortable and a little bit more energetic when he raps over them. And it kind of does make sense. These beats and these songs do sound like a lot of Lupe's older stuff, and they have a little bit of the youthful energy of a lot of his older stuff too. XO kind of reminds me of a combination of Intruder Alert and Streets on Fire, and King Nas reminds me of something that would be on Food and Liquor. It's a really nice old school tribute to his nephews. And I think that overall on this album, Lupe sounds more relaxed and natural than he has in the last decade. I've had this slight issue with Lupe in the past where a lot of his verses don't really seem very spontaneous. They feel very premeditated and composed. Like Lupe sat down and tried to think of the most clever and the most insightful things to say, and then put all of those together into a verse. Whereas on this album, it seems like Lupe is a little bit more natural, and the things he's saying feel more off the cuff, even if they're not. I feel like on this album, Lupe was really nicely able to balance his desire to build this huge palace of ideas where all the themes and all the narratives are all connected to each other, with the willingness to open up and just give us his true spontaneous feelings and thoughts. And I thought that balanced out really nicely, and I wonder if that's the reason that a lot of other critics felt like this album was a little scattered, because it did have very different tones at different times. But for me, hearing Lupe in those two different modes was kind of refreshing, because just as I was sort of starting to get sick of the pretentiousness and the distance that Lupe can convey at his most ideologically abstract, he'll start talking about something that's a little bit more personal, or spontaneously riffing off something in a pretty off-the-cuff and funny or silly way. I really hope that Lupe continues to deliver projects of this quality and of this depth in the future, and I hope he's a little bit more musically experimental in the future too. Overall, I'm glad I listened to this album. I'm glad I reviewed it and delved into the lyrics as much as I did. And I'd recommend this to pretty much anyone who enjoys conscious hip-hop. It's really quite good.